Again, hello, welcome to those watching at home. We're back on Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. This is our second to last week. This has gone quickly. This week we had part 4 called Consequences. So we've been kind of getting bits and pieces of the bigger story. This one fills in a lot of the gaps, this section. Um, they were very open all along, right? We're going to protect Jewish people. We don't see them as any different. Well, there's going to be consequences. One of the miracles of this story is that there weren't more consequences, as Roger's been saying, that it wasn't razed to the ground like some other villages were. But there were consequences. Some of them had nothing to do with the war, just random, senseless accidents. But some of them very much had to do with the fact that they were supporting Jews. So this was chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. Before we get into some quotes and passages, any thoughts or any stories that jumped out at you?
Well, this was sort of the previously, they were talking about how they were saving Jews and moving people one thing or another. This was sort of more of the somber side of it, losing of not even necessarily key members, but members of their cadre that were, he lost his son, he lost,
His cousins?
well, the other, I can't think of the other, but anyway, it's a little more somber in this section.
There was the young woman who was accidentally killed because this guy was playing with a pistol, right? His son who accidentally hanged himself trying to reenact something he saw on the plane. I read the book, I forget which. Someone behind the cloud, folks at home, your screen is not malfunctioning. Hi, come on in. Hello. Hi. What else? There was folks that were arrested and taken away. Here it comes back. But there were also just these kind of senseless things. I feel like I'm forgetting one. But then you also get a little bit of the backstory that there was the German doctor, right? Who was in charge of the forces in that area, who actually did keep at least one attack from coming to the town to protect them, who saw what they were doing. So,
Well, and then there was the story about, I guess the one German officer that was in charge. I guess the Gestapo wanted to go and
yeah,
page the city, right? But he kept putting them off.
which took me back to one of the things at the beginning that they said that the caring was contagious. That what these people were doing wasn't just only resistance, it wasn't just against the Nazis, but it was actually for these people, right? And it wasn't the defiance of like the Maquis, what they call it, or the other kind of freedom fighters. That was the other story. The guy who decided he needed to show he wasn't a coward, that he was fully into this effort, and ends up getting himself killed because he tries to free some people and says, okay, sure, you can send me on a train to Germany, I'll help people, but they send him to a prison and he gets killed instead, right? The other part of this is it shows how much more complicated it was than just the simple good guys versus bad guys. There was infighting within the different French resistance groups. There was suspicion of how patriotic you were or weren't, or what you would do after the war, or how far would you go, or oh no, we'll wait for the Allies to get here. No, we got to do something now, right? It wasn't just resistance versus Nazis. There's all these layers and wrinkles and complications. So I hope that you got a sense too, and still just a random chance of a girl getting shot by a pistol because somebody was playing with the gun. right? That even in the midst of the war, there was still just the quote unquote abnormal tragedies that could still happen to people. Um, there's still the fact that Chalkley was staying in a house and there was this woman who was kind of flirting with him, and so he asked Magda to come despite the risk it would make for her and him. Take her bicycle and get over there and be with him to help him avoid temptation, right? So all this other stuff was going on too, in the midst of everything else.
Life was going on.
Life was going on, yeah. Let's see. I have a couple passages kind of highlighted, but any others that stand out for y'all? It was a long section. Okay, well then I'll start throwing things out there, and if it triggers any other memories or thoughts, go for it. Start on page 203. Do you need a copy, Julie? I think there's still one more I want to take.
There was still two on the table.
Page 203, very first paragraph here. Very first sentence. If you stand firmly opposed to overwhelming destructive power, you expose yourself to destruction. Okay? At the bottom of that paragraph, they express their love for human beings not through discipline, but through an alert common sense. Right? Remember, they were amateurs. And I like that they say amateur doesn't just mean the opposite of professional, but it also comes from the same root of the word, like that's amore, right? Love, right? That you do it because you love it, not because you're great at it, not because you're part of a professional team, just because you love it. So in their case, their hobby, remember that word, the thing they were amateurs, lovers at, was helping these other people. But think of Jesus. Think of John the Baptist. If you stand firmly opposed to overwhelming destructive power, you expose yourself to destruction. You know, all the stories of the martyrs, the early saints, and Christians in places where Christianity was not in power or in a safe place. If you stand up to that, even if standing up to that destructive power is nothing more than, no, I won't conform, you are exposing yourself to destruction. That's part of their faith. Do you know of any other stories of that? Other people you can think of who were killed or persecuted for their faith?
The Quakers in the United States.
Yeah.
Well, right now, of course, more than the Quakers, all those not wing, I don't want to say wing groups, but all the non-standard forms of practicing and the Christianity in that country. Well, I don't want to say that. If you're a Christian in any other country other than ours, you're apt to be persecuted, aren't you?
Some places, yeah. I don't know about across the board, but some places for sure. And in Europe, so many of the churches there were state churches, or still are. You just kind of registered to a church when you're born.
Yeah, I don't think.
Part of your
persecuted,
taxes.
It's just kind
It
of
just-
non-existent.
But it's,
There's no persecution in Europe. You have to pay your taxes to the government, and the government supports the Protestant churches. Catholics, stuff like that. The churches are all state supported.
but the church has dwindled in influence
Right.
and size so much there that people might look at you funny if you're a Christian, like you're sticking with that, you know. But not like active
No,
persecution.
they're not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But other places,
But even, there's all kinds of religious persecution.
Yeah.
What's going on with Israel and much of the Middle East, with all the different sects that are fighting each other.
I think you're right, in Israel, there are a lot of Christians, particularly in the northern part of Israel, and they aren't particularly persecuted, not like other groups are. But maybe the government would like for them to leave, but then they don't think they're persecuted.
And a lot of Americans who are all about supporting that region don't realize that there can be such a thing as an Arab Christian. That's something I think you talked about Pastor Lizzie Yates last week. That's something she tries to educate people on all the time, but there are Arab Christians, Palestinian Christians, there are, yeah, there's Jews and Muslims, but not everybody who's an Arab ethnically is automatically Muslim religiously, right? Just like here, you could be anything, right? But yeah, depending on where you are, there's definitely persecution, and by sticking to your guns of your faith, to your, not your guns, but to your convictions, yeah, you're exposing yourself to destruction if people don't like that. But that, I think that's a good takeaway from this book. They did all of this knowing full well what could happen to them, and they did it anyway. Because it was the right thing to do, because these human beings, that's courage. It is.
Well, it was in the beginning of the United States, the Catholics were persecuted and,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, and, Maryland, that was their state, Maryland, I guess.
Mhm.
So they weren't persecuted there, but they were in almost every place else.
How big a deal was it when JFK became the first Catholic
Oh, I
president?
remember, yeah,
Oh, he's gonna answer to the Pope, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, and now, who else has been Catholic since then? I know Biden was Catholic, was anybody else? Maybe that's it, I know other candidates have been Catholic, but wasn't that big of a deal then, 50, 60 years later. At least as far as the Pope was concerned. Yeah, they stuck to their scruples. They put others' safety ahead of their own. As a matter of their faith. Even if they wouldn't admit to it being part of their faith, it was definitely an active resistance. Just a couple pages later, page 205. Would someone read that first paragraph? And that word there is chambonnet, I think.
But risk gave scrupulous Chaminade no such skills. Over the years of the occupation, they did not so much learn how to take care of themselves as that saving refugees was the important activity. Increasing danger taught them that the refugees were really in mortal danger and desperately needed their help. If the Gestapo threatened and even killed an unarmed person for protecting a refugee, what would they not do to their prey once they caught him? The increasing risks of the kitchen struggle did not harden the Chambonnais. It did not make them more and more safe by making them more and more canny at staying alive. It convinced them that they were needed by the refugees. The hardened soldier learns how to take care of himself and his buddies. The Chambonnais learned that they must take care of those others, or they would surely die. Risk made them set their jaws in the service of life. It did not make them safer soldiers. It made each one more of an amateur.
Thank you. So that I think is a really nice summary of their attitude.
It is.
And then the rest of that chapter is a story of Daniel Chokmay, Andre's cousin, the second cousin, talked about him having this condition where he wasn't supposed to overexert himself, and yet he's pulling wagons full of food and supplies up and down the hills and teaching in the school. He gets caught in that raid, him and the children get taken away. Any thoughts on the rest of that chapter, the story of Daniel Chokmay and the one successful raid that took him and some of the kids away?
Say who took the kids away.
Well, who was it? Was it the Gestapo? Yeah. And mom did going in and out of the house and back and forth on her bike in her apron, so people thought she worked there trying to negotiate something, protect anybody, so just throwing herself right in harm's way. Oh gosh, this one had the story of Magda having to hold her oldest son back because they saw a Gestapo officer beating a Jewish kid with his phylacteries. Do you know what phylacteries are? It's the little things that hang on the side of the head that have a little box of scriptures. It's got something on the end that's hard. And using his own religion, literally, concretely, to punish him and injure him. Yeah. Like you said, Jeffrey, we get the somber side of things. We have all these stories of the compassion and the protection, but in this, we see what they're being trying to protect them from, the cruelty and the violence.
Well, again, Quaker, there was a refuge, a residence in the village founded by the Quakers. So the Quakers, I guess, have always been pacifists, and come to the rescue of others.
Yeah, and they kept trying to ship people over into Switzerland, which was still neutral, which, well, sort of, but which was taking in refugees. Were you gonna say something?
Well, it's just a couple of things.
Yeah.
I guess I didn't understand why they didn't move more. But you know, why they housed some of them, the Jews, for so long instead of moving them through. And the other thing is, I didn't understand. I mean, the Germans were so, you know, methodical about the way they did things, that why they didn't just. I mean, I know that one guy was trying to protect his village, but,
Yeah, that was one.
you know, why they didn't just universally wipe out.
Wouldn't you like to think that there's a common thread of decency inside those people, those soldiers, the Gestapo? I mean, even they must have been had a very humankind thread in them.
Well, that's what the one guy who I guess he was a reserve officer, but he was sort of in charge. And later on, he goes to visit him after the war, and he's been a school teacher. I don't know if he taught history or mathematics or something, but anyway, he's been a schoolmaster, and you know, he said, well, I've been raised as a Catholic, and I just, you know.
That's right. But they were so indoctrinated from young up.
Yeah.
I don't know how old Willie Young was when he entered the, what was it, the boys in the German.
Oh,
Nazi youth. But I know he was really young then, and it was like, she said, like joining the Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
You know, that's what they felt like, you know, it was an organization, what we would consider the Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
They did not, you know.
But somehow you gotta see them right and wrong.
But also there was fear. They did, you know, if you're reading the books, they were afraid to tell on their neighbors. They were, you know, it just, people pulled it within themselves. They, you know.
I think there's the whole spectrum. I think there's some folks that just shut off a part, that compassionate part of their brain because of out of fear or just to stay with it. I think there were some folks who genuinely actually thrived on it. And everywhere in between, as you read the different stories. And there was so much conditioning and propaganda, and I think some folks probably later on had a change of heart or a deep sense of guilt and forgiveness, and there were others who didn't believe that the concentration camps were real, that it was all a hoax. But to what you were saying, Jeffrey, we do get a little taste of how hard it was to get them through the patrols, through the mountains, into Switzerland. If the paperwork didn't match, like if the name was spelled wrong, they'd have to come back. So I feel like they were probably moving folks steadily, but it was not a quick and easy.
To watch The Sound of Music.
Well, that's true, yeah. They had to walk over the mountains to.
Well, and that was one thing that I sort of explained it, but, cause I didn't realize that, I guess they had to petition the Swiss for.
Yeah, they
you know,
could just
this
walk in.
group that wanna bring over, and I guess the Swiss weren't necessarily against it, but they had to be careful too.
Yeah. And then, to the other piece, when you talked about why didn't they move more people, what was the other thing you said? Oh, how they didn't, yeah, that the Germans were so organized I think there were a lot of factors. They were in the southern part that didn't come under full Nazi control until at the very end. It was still the French police, so there was still degrees of separation. I think geography had a part to do with it. I think their reputation and a lot of external people trying to help, keep them off the radar had part to do with it. I think that, by the time the Germans did move south into France, it said they were getting desperate, which made them more dangerous and violent, but they were also more spread thin. What the Eastern Front in Russia was just decimating them. The group that the school teacher was in charge of was a group of captured Russians that they made work for the SS. That's why they were called the Tartar Squad or the Tartar region. They were conscripted, right? So by the time that we got to the part where they were getting under more scrutiny, the German army was more spread thin and more losses too. So everything seemed to come together. I like to think, on the one hand, I would like to say that God had a part in this, but at the same time, then why not save all the others too, right? So I think God was working in all these different towns and situations and hearts, trying to steer things back towards the good. And mourning along with us as tragedies happen and celebrating along with us with Le Chambon as some small successes we're going to do. Because if you go down the road of, well, God made this happen, then just like Chakmei and others later on got kind of disillusioned. If God protected them here, why not everywhere? Like that's a tricky, it's a sticky wicket. All right, chapter 9. I don't have particular passages to lift up here. Chapter 9 is called Flight from the Gestapo. This is about when Chakmei and his son for a while had to be on the run. That he would just bet on a course of action. That scene in the train station where his son almost got stranded and he managed to escape.
I can see that in a movie.
Right, right. But there's kind of like the internment camps. They show the extremes of Chakmei's conscience. If he was directly asked if he was the same person as on his fake card, he would not lie. So he could have ended up arrested and killed right on that spot if they would have just asked him a direct question because he didn't think he could lie. So again, that's another piece of this. Chakmei, Tis, the Huguenot village here, all of them were extremely unique. Yeah, the weird extreme personality of Chakmei that his son inherited that led him to accidentally die. I mean, everybody just went full tilt in this household. And later on, his partner, Edward Tis, said it was not reasonable, but I had to do it anyway. When he joined the Samad and started moving people into Switzerland. They all freely admit that what they did made no sense on paper, but yet they felt compelled to do it. Throughout all of this, in this section on the consequences, when you think of just the construction of the book, zooming out for a second, the first few sections are persons. Okay, so we get a little profile of who the leaders are. Beginnings. Okay, where did this come from? The first encounters and clashes with the athletic ceremony where the kids gave that leader the letter saying, we don't agree with what you did to the Jews in Paris, right? Like, when we get the help, the Quakers, the inspired amateurs, only now do we get to the consequences. And I think there's a reason for that. I think the reason the author put them in this order is that after all of the preceding, all of the selfless things they did, all of the work they did, all of the self-sacrifice they went through, then you get the consequences. Then you hear how throughout it, people were dying, getting arrested, and going on the run. To me, it puts everything that came before almost even more absurd. Wait, they did all this stuff and the consequences were still happening all along. It makes their amateur quality seem even more dangerous and therefore more faithful. That they put themselves in destruction's way.
You know, you don't know how much worse it would have been if they had not done anything.
If you start with the consequences, then it's gonna read like an action movie, right? Oh, they're in this conflict, they're gonna get him, oh, the underdog survived, but instead they talked about all the good things they're doing, and then you find out, oh my gosh. People got disappeared, people got arrested, people got killed and beaten and died, and still they did all of this. I don't know, by putting it in this kind of backwards order, it hits you different. Oops. Anything else from that? From chapter 9? Chapter 10 is called, The Death of an Eccentric. That one was about Roger LaForestier, who just had this really over the top personality. And to the point that people didn't trust him with their secrets because he just seemed so, yeah, that he stuck with it. That they were all in a way fools and madmen, not just him, even though he was more public about being a fool and a madman. Everything that they were doing was the stuff for fools and madmen. Anything else from that kind of profile on Roger LaForestier? LaForestier, however you say that. There's one bit on page 244, I'll highlight. Page 244, that first full paragraph that starts, his wife tracked down. When she finally figures out what happened to her husband, she finds out that he could have escaped. Some prisoners had succeeded in doing so. They invited him to come with them, but he had refused, saying that he had given his word of honor to go to Germany to help the wounded. Another told her that he was always as happy as a boy. He sang hymns, read the Bible to those who wished to hear it. And by his example and his words, he gave courage to everybody. His fellow prisoners loved him. That makes me think of when the other three, Trocmé, Tis, and Narcissac, were in the French internment camp. And they started having worship services and started sharing their gifts that they received, right? Faith in action. Something else. Anything else from chapter 10?
Well, it's just, you know, I guess maybe it's my personality, but I mean, I guess to me, it's, you know, when you say, okay, I'll go, and then you get a chance to get out of it, you don't take that chance. I guess maybe they didn't really understand or whatever, what the ultimate consequences would be.
What if they did understand? What would that be?
Well, I think Trocmé did. I mean, I think he knew that if recorded that he was gone, but
Do you
I don't know.
think they knew the ultimate consequences are, you know, when they, you know, war started? I mean, certainly there were lots of wars ahead of that one. I mean, I just wonder if they knew the consequences or if you just did it anyway.
I think they knew that there could be imprisonment, torture, maybe death for sure. I don't think that it came out until way later what was going on in Germany and Poland with the concentration camps. That was hidden. So maybe he thought, yeah, I might have some hard labor. I might have some, you know, really miserable time in front of me. But if by saying I'll go to Germany, help save these two friends of mine, then I'll go to Germany. I can help these people. I'm a doctor.
well, I guess that's what I was
Yeah.
thinking about. I mean, he, you know, if he had, I guess maybe he just didn't realize it at some point, till maybe it was too late, that, you know, the Germans weren't as honorable as he was, and
Sure.
instead of sending him to a hospital, they sent him to a prison camp.
Yeah.
You know, there's only so much he could do, but that's what I'm saying, if he had a chance to escape and didn't,
Mhm.
you know, I mean, Not that everybody is valuable, but I mean, as a doctor, he was very, could do a lot of good.
Yeah, with this book, there are times as I'm reading where I think to myself, what would I do, right? That's part of, I think, the function of this book. Is to make you ask that question of yourself, well, what would I have done? Or what would I do in that situation? And I hope that you're seeing, again, I would hope that I could stand up for my faith, stick to my convictions. Maybe I could try to be sneaky. I don't think I was have as much compunction lying about a fake ID as Trump may did. But would I, how would I do in that? And if I feel like I would fall short, or if I look at what they're doing and think to myself, man, I could never have done that, I wouldn't have done that. They're silly for doing that. Please don't feel bad about that, right? These were unique, exceptional people on a really crazy, intense, almost unprecedented circumstance.
People on the airplane, the 9/11, we don't remember that was brave what they did when they just took over the airplane. I mean, they knew they were gonna die, but I thought that was such an act of bravery.
Yeah. So you never know until you're in that moment. But I'm just, I guess a little disclaimer, don't beat yourself up if you feel like you wouldn't do what they were doing, because most people didn't. The story is lifted up because it is exceptional. All right, chapter 11. I have a few more passages to lift up from here. Chapter 11 is the Ascension weeks. Not only because the war was coming to an end and the Allies were arriving, even though it took a while, like any war, for that ripple of peace to make it to every place, but also because of these senseless deaths that happened down the stretch, so close to the end. One of their slogans, toujours prêt, always ready. And it was sort of a shorthand, toujours prêt à servir, always ready to help, right? So there again is their kind of what you call it, their foundation. Let's look at page 257. Let's see. Somebody read, starting with in the notes he wrote, a couple paragraphs there, maybe down at the bottom of the page.
In the notes he wrote in his 60s, he said he suddenly understood that human life is thrown into a world dominated by absurd and chaotic accidents. Instead of the world permissively ordered by God, in his notes he wrote, I had, without knowing it, joined Sparte and Callus, who were unknown at this time.
Two famous French authors, philosophers.
Sartre's ideas came from Sartre's ideas that each person is to himself a dark and useless hole in a full and pointless world. Amos' idea was that all our joy and all our valor come and go because of absurd circumstances, not because of any rationality or love in the universe as the center of, where at the center of Tarquin's grieving in his mind. Never before, except age of 10 when his mother died, had he fully realized how precious life of another person is. But never again would he believe that God protects precious life. Never again would he believe for God. From now on, God and Jesus were to him powerless, suffering, and limited God, still the Father. But he was as powerless as Tarquin the Father was. God could only join us in our grief and not save us from it.
Yeah. Despite how much he did and how many he saved, he still came out of it more cynical, more disillusioned with God. I don't think you can go through this level of horror and not come out unscathed. It says, the quote there at the bottom, even today I carry a death within myself, the death of my son. and I am like a decapitated pine. Pine trees do not regenerate their tops. They stay twisted, crippled. They grow in thickness, perhaps, and that is what I am doing. Remember, too, while he was on the run, he started putting on a bunch of weight because he was stuck hiding in rooms, and he already had a bad back, so that affected him the rest of his life, too. He says, I think less now, and I throw myself into action more. Under a scar that the years have thickened little by little, there bleeds in the very depths of my being an incurable wound, an awareness of nothingness, total resignation before nothingness, nothingness toward which I am going and toward which all of those around me are going to. But again, this is like 30 years later. That's bleak. This man who saved a lot of people and then gave so many people hope. And he said even after that, he couldn't really stick around Les Chambon anymore, right? He was changed. He got used to being the kind of the general giving orders. He stopped being with the people and just eventually moved on to be these international organizations and things like that. Somebody want to read that next paragraph there? These are not the words.
These are not the words that person permeated to the very foundation of its being with the peace-filled faith in God. He wrote in his notes, rarely do I possess peace. I have received it from God as a gift, but at the bottom of myself, all problems keep pouring themselves anew for me again and again. He was a turbulent man who looked like a great pine to others, that felt like a volcano ready to explode. The peace he felt in loving God and people crowned his life that did not pervade it. His grief over the death of Jean-Pierre tore off from the top his mind the peace that had been laid upon him, and revealed himself to himself as a churning molten mass, always thrusting itself restlessly outward.
Yeah. Then we get the story of Jean-Pierre's funeral. The next day, Magda goes to the cemetery and takes the ribbons off the bouquets of flowers because there's other kids who need those ribbons. And that was how she helped deal with it. And then top of page 259, after he wrote down the story of Magda getting those ribbons, he said, then I understood that she was coming back to health faster than I was. She had not lost her awareness of the external world. I had. Remember, Magda was all about the horizontal, right? People that are in need, I'm going to help them. That was her driving force. But Trocmé had the vertical too. And his relationship with God was shaken forever. Never to be fully at peace or healed again. He still wanted to help people, they still worked together. But his relationship with God was forever damaged. Same paragraph there, he says, she was more valiant than I was in the moment of greatest grief. It was about the well-being of others. She cried, he couldn't. She responded simply to people. He responded in addition to his own wild soul and to his God. With all his religious faith changed but remained, all he could do was suffer and find the same suffering as God. So he was forever beat up after that. Let's flip the page 261. So, I'm gonna close that since they just got out. We can handle the heat for a couple minutes. So, do you remember the part earlier, last week where we got into the Bible passages about what a city of refuge was? It was a place that if somebody accidentally killed another person, they would go to the city of refuge to find protection from the avengers, right? The ones who would, you killed my person, even if it was an accident, they wanted to avenge that person who died. So the legal protection of the city of refuge was until there could be a trial. So this section here, page 261, I think goes to the need for the city of refuge. Somebody read a couple paragraphs here, 261, but in Les Chambon.
But Les Chambon, Trocmé did much to keep such massacres from happening.
Oh, massacres of Germans, sorry.
Okay, the 120 German prisoners of the key were put in the artificial castle on something called the Castle Mars. Among them was their chief, Major Schmeling. Trusted partly to set an example for the region, went to the castle to preach to them, and Schmeling, though he was a Catholic, did all he could to get his soldiers to go to the Protestant services, and many of the German soldiers went. Trossemay's fellow Frenchmen, often members of the Marquis, objected to his sermons against war, sermons based upon the Ten Commandments and upon the belief that Christ had shown us that we must forgive sins instead of killing the sinner. They told him that nonviolence might be true in theory, but in practice, for people like those guys there in the castle, only force counts, and they reminded him of the recent German massacres and of the gas chambers in the death camps. When he gave the identical sermon in German to the prisoners in the afternoon, he gave his sermons in the temple in the morning, and the Germans listened politely and told him afterward that their own brave soldiers were ridding Europe of the Red Plague, Russian communism. When he mentioned the massacres and the gas chambers, they raised their shoulders unbelievingly and said, "Filthy, lying war propaganda."
Maybe that's you. Yeah.
Mm.
I think that is still believed by some,
My son,
and one a good friend of mine.
that it is a belief that has been perpetuated. Yeah, there's a lot of Holocaust deniers, and it helped them. But yeah, people.
I just find it, I've always found it. I guess the Germans just did a good job of covering it up. Or something, I don't know, I just
Mhm.
can't believe that more people didn't know about it.
Right.
They didn't have the American press, apparently.
Well, that was one of the first things. That was one of the first things Hitler did, was go after free press, because then he could control the narrative.
Oh, yeah, no, that part I understand.
Yeah.
You believe that there weren't, I don't know, it's so hard to keep a secret these days with anything.
Sure.
You know, some of these people have escaped out of, just some of these folks that came through Russia,
Mhm.
they went into Switzerland, I mean, why weren't they telling the story? If they were telling, it wasn't being heard.
Yeah. It wasn't being told for a long time.
I mean, you know, you talk about the Quakers, how come they had to know what was going on.
I don't know, it was really hard to get inside Germany and get information out. I don't know. But that's a different book. But here we have, and here we have in the aftermath, the French folks were getting mad at Charpnay for preaching to the German prisoners. The German prisoners didn't like what he was saying because they thought it was all propaganda. And down at the bottom of 261, both sides were utterly convinced of their own innocence and of the guilt of their adversaries. And that justified any killing of those guys there. The end of the war in France, it made no difference. People were bent on killing each other because of their own innocence and the other's guilt. So yeah, no wonder you needed cities of refuge. I mean, if you needed a city of refuge for manslaughter, for an accidental death, here's these German prisoners, you know, that they wanted to just go in and kill. I will maybe get in trouble for saying this, but I have deep concerns that there are folks being sent off to other countries, and today in our country, that there are people being picked up off the street and sent to detention centers in Louisiana, or even to that mega prison in El Salvador without due process. And they've already realized that they've made mistakes, and throwing people, arresting people because they have tattoos.
One of them's been in the news this week. The United States admits that they made a mistake, but they won't pay to bring him back.
Oh, they said, well, we can't bring back, he's in El Salvador now, that's out of our hands, but there's a judge ordering them to bring that person back.
I just thought it would please our country to come to that. I was reading all those stories yesterday.
So there's still stuff like this happening, where because you think you're right and innocent and the other people are wrong and bad, You could justify almost anything. There's people I've seen on TV, government officials, talking heads, you name it, people on the street saying, well, if they're here illegally, then they deserve it. We don't, why would we give them a trial? Why would we treat them better? Like, well, maybe we should treat everybody the same, So this stuff doesn't happen. I think this is a huge ethical
I think that's-
emergency.
That's one good thing about INSTEP. We have a few people who speak no English, a lot of them very broken English. But we never ask whether they're here legally. We ask to see if they're a resident of somewhere in the mechanical area, but we do not ask for citizenship papers.
And I hope that nothing is made to change there, that, I've heard stories out of Northern Virginia that there have been raids at food pantries, trying to catch the people coming for food, so I hope it doesn't come to that.
Well, they probably have more of it than we have.
They might, but
Yeah.
still, if these things have a habit of spreading.
Palestinian advocacy is being shut down, I should say, too. They're trying to.
You should be. There's nothing wrong in our country with protesting against a war. That doesn't mean you're against the country, it just means you're against the war. And even if you were against the country, that was kind of part of the founding of the country, right? Religious freedom, freedom to protest, freedom to assemble, like if that stuff if you start getting arrested for speaking your mind, then we're all in trouble.
I don't know the circumstances behind it, but when I had to get I lost my driver's license. I think I threw it in the trash.
Oh, no.
Well, I think I threw it away with a bag envelope, but anyway, I had to go to ask them to get a new driver's license. And the guy down in the corner, I could hear him, he obviously had an accent.
Mhm.
Was supposed to be producing a birth certificate and he didn't have it. And he was having to jump through so many hoops. I walked in the window, they asked me name, they asked me if I had any record, no, they looked up and I was out there in 30 seconds.
Yep.
What a difference between, I think he said he was from Bolivia or somewhere,
Sure.
and he could not prove his citizenship in the United States.
Yeah.
And, I understand the clerk, she was doing what she was trained to do.
But again, I might get in trouble for this, but I shouldn't get in trouble for having a conversation, right? That when people talk about the word,
in trouble.
hey, everybody, when people talk about the word privilege, that gets people's hackles up sometimes, because they'll say, well, I'm not privileged, I've never had anything given to me. But in terms of a different definition of that word would be what you experienced. The clerk was just following the rules. But
I was this little old white-headed lady who,
it's the privilege of not having to deal with it.
who wasn't questioned.
Yeah, it's not the privilege of somebody gave you something, it's the privilege of not having to deal with things that other people do.
But I also haven't broken the law, but I know.
Well, sure, but
I'm not sure I have, but.
who's to say this person didn't either? That's why you have the courts and the things and the rules, but still. If somebody breaks the rules, then they get the consequences, but you still have to go through the rules of the process on your
But
side.
in that case, the rules have changed, right? We're starting to make people believe that the rules have changed.
But you also do need to keep track of your paperwork.
Of course,
When we lived in Germany, when we went from country to country, we had to produce, military ID,
but if you lose track of your.
passport,
Yeah.
all of that. And we kept track of it, so I don't know whether some people don't realize how
Sure.
important it is to keep track of paperwork. I don't know.
Yeah, but does that mean you get sent to El Salvador?
Well, I kept up with my birth certificate for 69 years.
Yeah.
And now you've lost it?
And then I renewed my license back in January, and I wanted to upgrade to
The new one?
the,
Yeah.
whatever the new one's called,
Yeah.
so you can go
Right.
far from there. And do you think I could find it? Thing?
But you can get one, just notify the county you were born in, they'll send you another one.
Amityville Village in New York.
It's still there.
Yes, it is.
But that's just it, that's what I'm saying, is if. People make mistakes. And, sometimes the mistake does break the law, but you still treat that person, as a Christian, if I wanna have an impact on. Our country, then I would be the one saying, okay, well then let's still treat people with compassion and dignity, even if they make a mistake. Don't treat them like. And some folks have their student visas canceled without being notified of it, and then they get snatched off the street. Like what happened at Tufts University in Massachusetts. That person didn't even know their visa had been canceled, so how could they possibly go and say, okay, there's been a mistake or plead the case or anything? She got sent to Louisiana. They're trying to bring her back too, so it's,
Well,
I'm a little nervous right now, reading this book and then seeing some of the stuff. It's not the same, but boy, oh boy, I'm a little nervous.
I got into all that stuff on the internet yesterday, and I just can't believe that our country, that we're doing this, behaving this way, even though they could be overthrown. What are they, officers of some kind of office in the law that these people are.
But they're just following orders.
Well-
Pick them up.
They're just following orders, right? That's what makes me nervous.
That's right.
All right, one more thing, and we gotta close it up, we're running late. Page 265. Top paragraph there. Andre Chardonnay was too energetic, too surprisingly creative to be categorized neatly. There was one description of himself that even he accepted, which was that of a violent man conquered by God. Those who knew him best, including Tice, who was a profoundly nonviolent man, accepted this as the most apt description of him. There was a tension in him between anger and love that took different forms in different parts of his life. In his childhood, it took the form of anguish in his mother's death. In his youth, it took the form of union at St. Quentin and intense admiration for Kindler, the German soldier who taught him nonviolence. In his early parishes, it took the form of a passionate mysticism that was controlled by Margaret and her compassionate common sense that helped in that town with the redemption of that guy Solis who then, fell off. The form it took in Les Chambon is to be seen in a certain passage he wrote in his notes about the summer of '39, when Hitler was approaching the peak of his audacity and power. Chardonnay had just described Nazism as a way of unleashing the diabolical forces in mankind by using violence and violence. So that's the thing too that I want to have a takeaway here. All of us have this sin, this evil in our hearts. We had that whole conversation a while ago in one of our classes on the devil made me do it kind of stuff. Who did it? Right? So that's there, but sometimes you need that that catalyst to activate it. In this case, it was the Nazis. But there's always the opportunity to activate that dark side of things. So it's something to be aware of and on guard against individually and collectively. But he responded with nonviolence and everything they worked for. But he was full of intensity and awareness, destructive forces and creative forces, and we're supposed to be on the side of the creative forces because we're made in the image of God, who is fundamentally a creator, not a destroyer. Whatever else happens in Scripture, end of the day, the first act of God's grace was to create us in the first place. God didn't have to do that. That was grace. I think maybe next time we'll start with the end there. The last section to read is pretty short. Part 5 is called The Ethics of Life and Death. It is how goodness happened here, and some closing thoughts, and then a postscript. So a short one for next time if you need to catch up on the other ones. We'll start with page 266 to finish this one off, and then we'll go into the last part. Thank you, everybody. I gotta go. It's time for worship. Thank you.
Oh, that's cool.